Good morning, everyone. My name is Mark Canavera. I am the Associate Director of the CPC Learning Network. The CPC Learning Network is an initiative to bring together policymakers, researchers, and practitioners who are working on issues related to child protection and family welfare to build more and better evidence about what works to support children and families in adversity. We are very excited to present today's webinar on social norms and how those link with violence prevention and reduction initiatives, and we have two stellar presenters to speak with you today. Alina Potts is a research and evaluation specialist for child protection at UNICEF's Office of Research-Innocenti. She joined Innocenti in March 2015 to coordinate UNICEF's multi-country study on the drivers of violence affecting children. She also provides technical advice on applied research examining the intersection between intimate partner violence and violence affecting children in emergencies, an initiative called Thrive, Transforming Households. She holds an MPH from Columbia University's Forced Migration and Health program and has led gender-based violence programming in a number of humanitarian response efforts over the past decade. She has a lot of experience in field-based research, including on grave violations of children in armed conflict, and she has worked with refugees and asylum seekers in the US, the UK, and Ireland. Alina will start and then hand over to Dr. Ben Cislaghi. I hope I've pronounced it well. Ben, you can correct me when you take the microphone. Ben is a lecturer in social norms at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. Before joining academia, he worked for a number of NGOs and international organizations, including UNICEF, the World Health Organization, and the International Labour Organization. He's been working on social norms since 2009. After doing his doctorate on human rights and social change, he worked for 3 years in Senegal as the director of research monitoring and evaluation for the non-government organization Tostan, which is a truly wonderful internationally recognized NGO working on social norms throughout West Africa. He's also worked as a researcher with Stanford University and Columbia Universities. At the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, he is gathering together a community of experts on social norms to advance the understanding of how social norms change and that change can be measured. So with no further ado, we will now hear from Alina. Over to you, Alina.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mark, for the introductions, and welcome everybody that we can't see, but we're happy you're here with us virtually. I hope that everyone can hear me, and I hope that if you can't hear me, there will be a way for me to know that. So I am going to start, and just to say quickly, you know, Ben and I will be but we've set a few objectives for it. So really to give an introduction to the basic concepts and definitions in the social norms field, including what it means to diagnose and measure social norms, and then really to share some applied learning from violence prevention initiatives specifically that have started to use this theoretical framework to understand how we can improve efforts to prevent violence. And you can see a number of actors here. We'll give a sneak peek into some of the work that Ben's doing and that I'm doing as well.
And if you
but to start off,
sorry to interrupt you, Alina, if you can't hear, you can let us know via the questions or the chat boxes, which should be part of your GoToWebinar panel. And we are monitoring those, and we'll make sure that those get to the presenters.
And we're going to practice using the chat panel right now, because to start off, I'm hoping that we can have something somewhat participatory. And just want to pose to you the question, what's the first thing that comes to mind when you hear the term social norms? There's a lot of terminology that's thrown around. I see this and read it and hear it in conversations a lot. So if you could use the chat panel to just put in a word or a phrase, whatever comes to mind, we can get a sense of some of the things that you think of when you hear this term. Okay, and Mark, I can't see anything. I don't know if you're seeing any kind of inputs coming in.
Nothing's come through yet, but I suspect that people are just typing away. I'm typing one. Let's see if it shows up.
Okay, let's see if it shows up. Aha. Well, I see that Mark Canavera thinks, when I hear social norms, I think of attitudes that people have towards specific issues, which I realize now is a limited understanding. So I think this is a great jumping off point. I would invite people, if you're still looking for the chat box or still thinking, at any point during the training to type in, what you think when you hear this term. It's really helpful for Ben and I to orient ourselves. And we will briefly touch on attitudes and on how those may be different than social norms. But from here, I'd like to turn it over to Ben to start with the introduction of the history of this field that we're calling social norms.
Thank you. Okay, so thank you for your introduction, Mark, and you almost got my name right. It's pronounced Cislaghi, like cheese. So as you can hear, I'm an Italian. I work in the UK. Today is not the brightest day for Europeans in the UK. I started with this slide because we're talking about violence today, and my first example oh, there you go. So you should be able to see my screen now. I start with this slide because the first example that I'm drawing on today is related to homosexuality. But I thought we couldn't really start talking about social norms and violence without citing Orlando and the tragic event that happened there that you all so well know. And of course, I just want to say I don't personally believe, I don't know exactly what motivated the behavior of the man who did what he did. I just want to say that most likely social norms did not play a main, might not have played a main role in driving that person's behavior. So just so we think that there are many behavioral drivers, of people's actions, and so just that we have this disclaimer, because my first example is based on homosexuality, I don't want you to think that I would implicitly suggest that the Orlando events were specifically motivated by social norms. Okay, so this man is a Senegalese singer, and his name is Wally Seck. He sings great songs, by the way. And so one day, Wally Seck, who's an innovator and a role model for many people in Senegal, decided to wear a pink bag. And that became a great thing. It opened a big debate, and people were like, you shouldn't wear pink bags, and what will our children learn, and start saying. And so I jumped on this discussion with Ndeye, who is from Senegal, and we've known each other for 3 years, and she worked as a house keeper in the neighborhood where I lived. And I told her, but Ndeye, I really disagree with this. I don't understand. Everyone can wear the bag of the color they prefer. And she said, and it's an actual conversation. She said, Ben, are you joking? How can a man wear a pink bag? Have you ever seen a man with a pink bag? Men just don't wear pink bags. And so I sensed the opportunity there, and I said, well, you know what? I want to. I buy one and go around in a neighborhood with it. And she said, oh, Ben, I would never allow you to do that. What will people think if they saw you in the streets with a pink bag? Come on, stop being silly. And as we see, you have a norm right there. Men don't wear pink bags. And you might think, well, okay, but what is the extent to this? Well, for days, the first page of the newspapers were talking about this. And there were marches, and there were people arrested, and there were acts of violence, and it is actually something that happens often in Senegal, as a response. So this is the case of, well, it happened in the past, not often, but happened in the past. And this is an example from the University of Dakar. This is when a group of people surrounded and pushed within a bar a man who was said to be homosexual, and he was lynched. And the title says a presumed homosexual man is lynched on campus. So what did WALL-E-SEC have to do? Well, he had to go on stage and actually cut his pink bag publicly so that people will stop talking about this. All this it makes a lot of sense. So you see that these are what we call social norms, really rules that if you go against, well, it has consequences, and we owe these rules to this guy here, whose species is Homo heidelbergensis, and he kind of lived across a little bit earlier than us. He lived between 500 and 700,000 years ago, and he's a predecessor of the Homo sapiens, right? And he's so important because when the Homo heidelbergensis came on Earth, well, that's when we started working together, intentionally share work. And that's an evolutionary game changer because all of a sudden we started becoming what people say, what scholars call ultra-social. That means that we're capable, we are one of the few species on Earth who are capable of collaborating, organizing our action among hundreds of individuals, including individuals who are not members of our family. Okay, and it's us and a few species of bugs, and that's it. Not even chimps are ultra-social. And we're also capable of sharing culture across generations. So that's very important because when we started doing that, when cooperation became such an important element of our being humans, that became an evolutionary advantage. That means that groups who could cooperate better, well, they would have better access to resources. In case of war, they could defend better themselves. So groups who had better cooperation succeeded. And then, as you see on the right, well, individuals with group-mindedness became fittest because groups needed individuals with group-mindedness. So if you were selfish and you stayed behind during a war, well, when you came back, most likely people wouldn't share food with you, wouldn't share resources with you. So the point then becomes, how did we know if people were actually behaving according to what the group rules were or not? Well, this is the mechanism that evolution selected is sanctions, essentially demonstrating to people who are not complying with the group's expectations that they're not doing it. And we don't need language for those, like Bernie here. He's clearly sanctioning what somebody said without using any words, and probably fishing on our most instinctive way of sanctioning. So this system of rules that came out of evolution as a way of making it through the challenges, the evolutionary challenges that we faced, today drive a lot of people's actions. Here we've got some examples: drinking behaviors, hand washing, recreational drugs, parental practices, voting, recycling, and these are just examples. There is a lot of evidence on how norms can influence what we do. But what really are social norms? Well, social norms essentially are beliefs that people have. So you take a group and you try to understand what is that these people believe is typical, and remember the word typical in their group, which also means what do they believe that others are doing, right? So of course in different groups people do different things, and this makes me also always think of the sheep effect. The simple fact that people are doing something, that you believe that people are doing something, may condition your readiness to do that or not. So here's a couple of examples. Look at how quickly United States, the number of states that endorsed women's suffrage went up. So in 10 years, it passed from, 4 to 28. And in more recent times, look at same-sex marriage. It passed from 368 in 2012 to 36 in 2016. So the fact that this is really the growing of the critical mass, right? The more people you see that are doing something, the readier you are, and that's a positive cycle. If that is true, then These kind of interventions that try to sensitize individuals around their limits is less effective than these are the type of interventions that has recently come to the fore. That is increased, and we see that it's increasingly used more and more. So essentially here, what is that this intervention is trying to do? Well, it's trying to change what people believe others do. This intervention says 7 out of 10 students don't drink alcohol. And look at this other one. This one says, you know, 88% of students don't smoke. This intervention, however, has also another message. I only kiss people whose breath doesn't stink. And that's called, so the blue thing is, as we said, about trying to change beliefs about what others do. But the red thing is trying to change beliefs about what people, what students approve and disapprove, which is the second type of social norm, which is really what people believe is appropriate in their group. That means what are others approving of? What should I do to be approved? So typical and appropriate. And how do we know if what we're doing is appropriate or not? Well, non-compliers will be negatively sanctioned, like this poor guy who's being laughed at, and compliers will be positively sanctioned. So why do harmful social norms persist? You might think, well, okay, this all makes sense, but if it's evolutionary, then at a certain moment, if a social norm is actually working against us as a species, why does it persist? Well, we just talked about sanctions. So norms lock people into a social equilibrium, in this case is A, and nobody alone can change it without coordinated action. Look at this ball, which is possibility of change. You see how it can't go really through the equilibrium A that is created, because the perturbation that I'm simulating is not strong enough. And why is it not strong enough? Well, not enough people are ready to face the consequences of sanctions. Not enough people for others to see that actually the norm is changing. But if we do raise that equilibrium, for instance, creating awareness that many actually disagree with the norm, or that the behavior is harmful, and so you have groups that are renegotiating the norm, or maybe you reduce the outcome expectations that come from following the norm, well, then less effort is required to move from an equilibrium A to an equilibrium B. And so that, which means that that people will be readier to start that critical mass change that we've seen is part of influences both descriptive and injunctive social norms, that is both what is typical, beliefs about what is typical and what is appropriate. Alina, do you want to take over?
Yes,
All right,
I have been
back to
unmuted. Okay, thank you, Mark, and thanks, Ben. You guys can see how interesting and exciting social norms is. So I'm going to ground what Ben's shared with us so far a bit in the violence prevention work and some kind of recent developments, let's say over the past 5 to 10 years, to start putting this into practice. And so this quote is taken from a recent DFID guidance note, Shifting Social Norms to Tackle Violence Against Women and Girls. And I should say most of my work and experience focuses on violence against women and girls, gender-based violence, and violence affecting children more broadly. So that's the field that I'm coming from, and that I hope you can find helpful either for your work in that field or in others. And so there's been a widespread recognition in the development community that attitudes, norms, and beliefs that justify violence and gender inequality are important. But what's been lacking is clarity about definitions of these things and relationships between these constructs. And I saw Mark shared with us some of the chat box chatter in terms of, you know, what's the first thing that comes to mind when thinking about social norms? And a lot of people wrote attitudes and beliefs. Some people talked about collective behaviors. One person mentioned men and women norms. So all very important. We know they're important. We talk about them, and really where we can move now is in having a common kind of framework, or at least a shared idea of the frameworks that exist and how those can be useful to our work. So in thinking about this and thinking about what Ben has shared, we can see that here we have three components, and Diffit has highlighted these looking across the range of theorists and social norms, the range of work that's been done, and the range of terminology to say, more or less, we can say that social norms consist of shared beliefs about others. So this is what Ben talked about in terms of what's typical and what's appropriate. And typical behavior being something that we think others do, and we think that one receives approval for doing these things or disapproval for not doing them. And then appropriate being we believe that others expect us to do these things, and that we will receive approval if we do them, and we will receive disapproval if we don't. So in that way, the social expectations of the group is driving our decision to carry out the behavior or not. That these exist within reference groups, which Ben noted, and also that this function of either approval or disapproval can be very strong in maintaining a social norm, but we'll also talk about some examples of how this can be harnessed, and he's already shown us through the examples, for example, smoking, how this can be harnessed to try to change certain norms. So again, when we think about social norms and words like attitude and belief come up, it's important to note a distinction that's made in the field between what are socially driven behaviors and what behaviors are driven by non-social or personal beliefs. So in this way, there are several terms that are used, but for the purpose of this webinar, we can say that what I do because either I like to do it or I don't like to do it, and I don't care what others think, I'm going to do it because of my own favor or disfavor, we could call an attitude. What I believe to be morally right or wrong, and again, despite what the group may think, despite receiving disapproval from people that I care about, I would follow this belief, I would into action, is what we could call a moral belief. And then finally, what I believe to be true or false, regardless of whether it's actually true or false, is what we call a factual belief. So for example, even if I think the world is flat, and there's been a lot of evidence to prove that it's round, if I think that climate change is made up and that the climate is perfectly fine, this would be what we're calling a factual belief. And so we can see how this is important in thinking about interventions, because if we're trying to change something, to change a harmful behavior that's based on a misguided factual belief, for example, I think that sickness comes from, let's say, from the gods, right? And I have done something to displease the gods. We can respect the fact that a person's spiritual beliefs and that this belief is very important to them, but we could also understand that not understanding the role of germs in causing sickness could be very detrimental to that person's health and the community's health. And so in this way, introducing some new information, some new facts may be enough to change certain behaviors to increase well-being in that person's life and in the community. And so this is where it's important to understand, are we looking at factual beliefs as the main driver here, or at moral beliefs, at attitudes, or is it the expectation of what's typical and appropriate in that group of people that's driving behavior? So to talk a little bit more about the idea of reference groups, one way of thinking about this is in terms of relationships. So when we're thinking of the communities that we work in, that word community in and of itself is often very hard to define. So here are some questions that you could use to start making sense of that for the community, the group of people, the behavior that you're interested in. Thinking about who trusts whom and for what, who gossips, who's in the same family, who intermarries, and more specifically, social roles, ways that money and resources are transferred, ways that people act with each other, can be very important in understanding the types of networks that we're interested in influencing. So for example, when thinking about violence, you can see that under acts, we could look at who people eat with, but also who attacks whom or who bullies whom. In terms of what's called here co-occurrence, we can think of who's going to the same health center as whom, who's using the same toilet as whom. And the reason that this is important is to start to understand the various networks that people are part of and how they may affect their behavior. So often one person could find a certain reference group, for example, a child at school may be very affected by what they believe their peers expect of them. That same child, when going to church, could be very driven instead by the congregation, what they think is typical and appropriate behavior in that congregation. So reference groups may change in different ways for different people, but we'll do a short. We're not going to be able to do it because it's a webinar, but we'll just go over a short exercise that you may find useful when applying this to the violence work that you're engaged in. So for example, when we think about violence affecting children, we want to take into consideration both the child's perspective and the parent's perspective. So using one of those relationship categories that was mentioned on the previous slide, trust. Let's say, for example, and when we did this in a training, one of the groups talked about sexual violence. And so they talked about if a child experiences sexual violence, who would that child trust to report to talk to about it, to go to for help, and why? And also from the parent's perspective or caregiver's perspective, who would that person trust and why? And so we can see in this example from the exercise that a child may feel blame, they may not feel they can trust anyone, a parent may have different incentives for either keeping the event very quiet or perhaps going to authorities, going to the police. The important point here is that the networks that are formed, the networks of trust, the networks of support, the networks of influence will probably vary by the type of behavior or the type of event that we're talking about. So for example, if the same exercise were done thinking about corporal punishment in schools or thinking about peer bullying, those networks of support and harm and influence would look very different. So for whatever intervention you're working on, it's not going to be a one-size-fits-all approach, but rather it's understanding the relationships that exist and the relationships that are important in influencing behavior so that you can start to think critically about, who do we target first? Which groups do we start with first? If we want to in the end, make the home a safer place for children and we want to reduce the use of corporal punishment in the home, do we start by talking to the parents? Do we start by talking to people the parents look up to? Do we start by talking with children, or do we do a combination of these things? So not to be prescriptive, but to give you some ideas and tools. And then this idea of approval and disapproval, Ben also spoke about this and how this group of people, this reference group, may either reward those who comply or punish violators. So again, very powerful to think about when considering both how to change harmful existing norms or potentially create new helpful norms. And sanctions can actually be very useful, as we saw with the smoking example. I don't kiss anyone who smokes. Maybe that can be a sanction that can create a helpful new norm of not smoking. And just to touch on, this is a very, again, we're trying to give you a taste of what's out there. But just to touch on the idea that when we see violence prevention efforts in law and in legal prohibition, sometimes we don't see the behavior change that we expect coming after those laws. So even when a legal prohibition is in place, for example, it's illegal to beat your child at home, maybe that behavior continues. It's illegal to abuse your wife. Maybe that behavior continues to quite a high extent. And that can be because there are other driving factors. So it's important to think about with legal prohibitions, if we're not seeing the change we expect, why is that? What are potentially some of the driving factors, and perhaps they are social norms that are perpetuating that behavior? And what is the best timing for introducing legal reforms that really can support a change in behavior? So this is the question one of the questions that we posed for this webinar: is violence a social norm? And I am hopeful that the technology will allow me to share with you the thoughts of Bob Bloom, who is a medical doctor and principal investigator for the Global Early Adolescent Study run out of Johns Hopkins University, which is really looking at gender norms, gender socialization, which I'll talk about in a minute, and how girls grow up and learn what it means to become a woman, or boys grow up and learn what it means to become a man. And so we posed to him the question, is violence a social norm? This is what he had to say. And Mark, I trust that you will let me know if there's any trouble hearing this.
Absolutely.
I would say absolutely it is not a social norm. I think the tolerance for violence varies hugely by social context, and it varies hugely within any given geographic area. So it isn't even a cultural norm, because you see within countries tremendous variation in tolerance for gender-based violence and for interpersonal violence. I think that what is much more a social norm, sadly and problematically, is male dominance and the corollary of that is female passivity. Young people are socialized very early into male dominance. That doesn't necessarily translate to violence, but in some societies it does. But that's not inherent. That in no way is either a gender norm or a social norm in the community.
Okay, so we've heard from Bob. We'll share some resources at the end of the presentation, including the website for that study. But just to note, there are different views out there. We really encourage you to look further into social norms theory if you haven't yet, to apply it and to contribute to these discussions. I also feel that the violence is not a social norm, but rather is supported by other harmful behaviors and beliefs that are social norms. And so I want to, before handing back over to Ben, to just give another view into a framework that's been very important in a lot of violence prevention work. So the work that I'm doing, the work that Ben is involved with at the London School, the work of WHO and CDC, a lot of it has drawn on what's called the socio-ecological model, which many of you are probably familiar with and also use. And this is coming out of the work of Urie Bronfenbrenner, who was a developmental psychologist. And he was working in the 70s and looking at how psychologists were studying children's development. And so a lot of it was happening in a lab, a very artificial setting, not realizing the ecology or the environment and the social nature or the relationships that children grow up within and how important these are to a child's development. So not only the child's inner life, the life of the individual, but also within their family, within their community and school, what he referred to as the, let's say, meso or middle kind of layers. So this would be community, school, and then the macro, so institutional or structural. And we can see how this has been adapted in violence work. Namely, I found very important the work of Lori Heisey in applying this to intimate partner violence. And so here you can see, and the socio-ecological model is typically a diagram with nested circles or ovals. And you can see here how she's adapted that to look at women in relationship to a male partner, but also in relationship to their community and to the macro-social or the institutional and structural factors that may be driving intimate partner violence, which we see in this orange circle abbreviated as IPV and what she calls the conflict arena. So I'll just give you a taste of this. There's a lot of text here. But what I want to highlight is that when looking at drivers in individual, within the relationship, within the community, we do see this idea of norms coming up as very important. And I know it's quite hard to read this slide, but just to give a closer look of what that says, some of the examples of social and gender norms that are supporting violence against women and girls. So it might be that the belief that a man has a right to assert power over a woman, or that physical violence is an acceptable way to resolve conflict in a relationship, that divorce is shameful, so to leave a harmful relationship is very shameful. So we can see how these things, while in and of themselves are not the only cause of such violence, they're very important contributing factors and drivers, and without knowing how to address these, along with maybe other factors, we won't be able to make those relationships safe. We won't be able to reduce intimate partner violence, for example. And we can also see how these norms contribute to other types of violence. Finally, to give a quick sneak peek into the work I'm involved in at UNICEF Office of Research-Innocenti, and you can see this is a work in progress, but really, sharing it to show you what we're thinking and the conversations we would like to engage in with others involved in violence prevention work. Looking at the socio-ecological model from the individual, again, through interpersonal, community, institutional, and structural levels, and looking across 4 very different countries, Peru, Vietnam, Zimbabwe, and Italy. We're starting to work with teams in those countries to classify some of the main drivers of the different types of violence affecting children, so physical, sexual, emotional violence. And again, this is a work in progress. It's not prescriptive, but it's meant to show the types of things that may come up and how this socio-ecological framework is very useful in helping you and your team to situate, where do we think this is interacting? So for example, again, here we've placed harmful social and gender norms at the community level. And then from that, how do we think through interventions we could address some of those norms? And so finally, to speak to this question, and I really appreciate the person who said, men and women norms is something that comes up when I think of social norms. This is really important when applying social norms theory specifically to violence prevention, to think about gender norms as widely held beliefs about what's typical and appropriate behavior for men and women. And these not only shape how men and women see themselves and their social and intimate relationships, but also sexuality, so the idea of a binary sexuality versus other sexualities, and the allocation of power and resources. And I really want to highlight power as I think a power analysis is very important to bring to social norms theory. It's something that I think the violence lens can really contribute, because as practitioners or researchers or other stakeholders working on violence, we know this is important. So with that, I'll hand back over to Ben.
Yes, Mike, you're going to put back my screen on and get screen on. So we've learned that. Show my screen. We've learned that there is an evolutionary reason why social norms are important. So they are ingrained mechanisms. We can't really decide whether to use them or not. They're there. We've seen that they define what their beliefs that defines what's typical and appropriate, not what's really typical. What's important is the belief. We've seen that is the anticipation of the sanction for non-compliers that keeps society in a certain equilibrium. And we've seen how, and so perturbation needs to be significant, or we need to raise the equilibrium bar. And we've seen how that relates to violence and gender norms. So what about intervention then? Okay, so first of all, what we understand is, what we derive from the theory is be careful of the kind of interventions that you frame. Okay, so if knowing that if the belief that the behavior is very much well spread reinforces that behavior, well, then interventions like this one may achieve the opposite of what they're trying to achieve. So even if it's clear the intention, which is to shock the public about the great extent, the risk, the empirical evidence that has been produced by the social norm field in the recent years says that might be not the best intervention. Second, beware of silver bullets. Social norms are important drivers of behavior, but this can be moderated. Take addictiveness, right? I can know very well that nobody in my reference group bets at the casino, but this is such an addictive behavior that I don't really care. So the addictiveness trumps my normative beliefs. Or take, outcome expectations, which is another quite immediate one. I might disagree, I might know what the norm is, but knowing that I can get a super important outcome for my life by non-complying with the norm, which is way greater than the sanction that I risk, might just trump the norm. So there are mediators effects, and Chung and Rimal have recently just produced a great review of these moderator effects. The other side, the other point that should make us aware of silver bullets is that social norms as Alina said, are one of the different cogs of behavioral drivers. And then pay attention to the different interventions that you might bring in the ground. Yes, social norm campaign are most appropriate, and to be honest, a social norms perspective can be adopted to every intervention. Community conversations as the one that have been put in place by Torsten, Selima, Sasa, and to a certain extent, core provisionarians facilitated those community conversations, can be extremely effective. And I've worked for Torsten, so I think that the Torsten model is a good model that can offer inspirations to how community conversations can happen. They start from a vision. What is that we want to achieve for this community, and our individual and collective aspirations. And those visions are then framed into human rights so that human rights are not brought in as a top-down approach, but rather as a critical curriculum. So this is what your government assigned. Do you like it? You don't like it? Why do you like it? Why you don't like it? What's that you like in it? Do you see it in your village if you like it? Why you don't see it in your village? Well, I don't see it in my village because we have these practices. What's fun is that these, if human rights are contextualized within the local culture, as it should be done to avoid imperialism, then I recognize then some of the cultural values. What I like in this right is what I find in my values. So the incoherence between values and practices then motivates to realign values and practices. So for instance, yes, we love our children, and yet we are not allowing them to get out of the household before they are 7, right? And then we have, and then we know that that's not compatible with our values, which is socialization, whatever, as an example. So how can we change that? Or corporal punishment is another great example. We love our children, and we hit them because we believe that that's for their best. We realize that we're hurting them. How can we change? Well, we need new knowledge. We need to know new ways of behaving with our children, or new ways of behaving between ourselves, and new skills. Although we might not change that, this behavior, especially when that is interdependent, so it needs different people together. So we need public speaking, project management, collective action, the capacity of discussing democratically. So how do we achieve then greater change? Well, of course, individuals may just change behavior independently, but all that behavior that is independent requires for this core group that has participated in the community discussion that will include various sectors of the population to expand and pull in others, make sure that the decision makers are on board, that the power holders are on board, and that they don't capture and hijack the process, so that public actions and commitments then result in collective changes. So this is a very simple model. There is a more complex model, and I gave you the references. It's of course a 2-hour discussion, just the model itself, but we can have it in another place. So the other question some of you might have is, how do we do the monitoring evaluation of social normative intervention? And there is a great document that Maki, Monetti, Shakya, and Gillet published, which is called "What Are Social Norms and How They Measure?" and it's freely available, and I'd rather refer you to that. But what I want to tell you is something that is not in that document. So we need to diagnose normative influence to begin with. And I'm going to tell you the model that we developed when I was working at Torsten. Why do we need to diagnose normative influence? Well, norms can have a direct influence on the practice. And FGC is such a blatant example of that. And it's not a good model for all behavior. In FGC, the norm around cutting girls is what it's actually influencing the cutting behavior. But norms could have indirect influence on the practice, and that's where things get messier. Bob Blum is right in saying, well, there's no norm around violence that results in the violent behavior, but there might be normative beliefs that underlying to the fabric of violence that contributes to perpetrating intimate partner violence. Take, for instance, family privacy, or there might be little to none effect that norms are having on a particular practice that you're interested in working or studying on. So you might just be vaccinating your children because you never thought that was a good point. But then an intervention might create new normative beliefs, and at the end of the intervention, which in the case of Torsten lasts for 3 years, I might believe, or in your case might last 1 or 2 years, I might believe that if I don't vaccinate my children, others in the community will disapprove me, will sanction me, will come and take my children away, or will just not share the resources with me. Okay, so what do we really need to do to explore norms? Now that we know what the normative belief strength is, well, we need to understand what the reference group is. We need to understand how typical and how appropriate that particular belief is. Those beliefs, how prevalent typicality and beliefs of typicality and appropriateness are in that particular reference group. So how do we identify reference group? Well, qualitative methods offer a great avenue. I really like. I developed questions. I used question 3 recently, and I found it works quite well. If you did or you didn't do X, who you couldn't tell, and why. But these are just examples. There are plenty of good qualitative questions around. If you wanted to decide whether to do X, who advice would you go and ask? Or after the last question, after you did X, who were the first persons you told and why? Other ways of identifying reference groups include social network analysis, which is a very interesting but resource-consuming technique when it's done quantitatively. So researchers in this picture believe that, initially believe that reference groups overlap with villages that you see represented in different colors. And they thought, well, so use of latrines, round have latrines, squares don't have latrines. Use of latrines is not normative because people in the villages some have latrines and some don't. But when they actually mapped out their relationships, well, what they found is that reference groups were not overlapping with the geographical setting, but they were cutting across different villages, and they did overlap with latrine use. Or this is a qualitative way of using social network analysis that is less labor intensive and then can still be informative. And essentially you map out social networks together with your participants, and Bettina Duncan has been doing the last stuff. Then the other thing you need to do is actually understand how typical and appropriate a certain belief is. Vignettes have come up to the fore as a great method back in 2009 when we started using them. They were still experimental, but they're good. Look at, we told the story of this woman who wants to capture her daughter, and we found people saying, yeah, of course we practice, everyone practices efficacy around here, which is an indication of typicality. And then we found family honor. The entire family is honored when a woman is kept, when a girl is kept, appropriateness. How do you measure that? So you can't do qualitative on larger samples. Well, the Toston method is essentially to pass sensitive behaviors across in a list of behavior and ask, okay, in your opinion, how many people of your community do the following, right? Everyone, more than half, less than half, just a few, nobody. And so that people essentially will tell you, well, almost everyone baptizes their child around here. And we have less sensitive questions, not because they hide the more sensitive questions, but also because they kind of give you control. And then we have the injunctive. And what's interesting in this method is that you ask your enumerator to actually code the answer. So if somebody said, okay, how would your family react if they knew you were going to catch your daughter? And the interviewee says, oh, they will throw up a party. That's your enumerator that needs to code that as positive response, or negative response, or indifference, or change intervention. We will actually try and come and talk to me and change. Okay, so you need to train very well, of course, your enumerator. And then you come up with this data, and that's the last point that I want to make. That is really important. You come up with this data. So here's our data crunched once we crunch them for the country of Mali. And you see, it's difficult to make sense of this data, and it's quite obvious why. Because here we have data that are collected across different reference groups. But look at what happens when you actually disaggregate those data by reference groups. So in V6, which is village 6, it's very easy to understand that descriptive norms around what others do are all in favor of almost nobody. And in village B, don't bother with the identifiers. Village B is almost everyone. But if you put village B and village 6 together, well, then you don't really understand what's going on. And at the same time, you will still have villages at village 5 where, of course, perceptions are changing. This data were collected in a midline. So to sum up, to sum up about this method I presented, 3 things are important. Create hypotheses about the reference group based on evidence. Have enumerators code responses. That requires a good training, though. And disaggregate data at the reference group level, if that's possible. This is not the only method. This is the Toston method that I developed in 2014 when I was at Boston. There are many more methods that can be found in the literature. Be open to track shift and emergence. Remember that if you're trying to build new norms, then you will have to measure them at baseline as well as endline, even if that means that you have no norms at baseline. So Alina, I think this is our last slide, and we wanted to make 1 point each. So I'll go for the first one. So what we said today is that social norms affect behavior because people often tend to do what they believe others do and approve of, and this comes out of, in my work, out of evolutionary theory. Do you want to read the second one, Alina? Or maybe I could read the second one and you read the third and fourth one.
Alina
so
can read again, sorry.
Okay, okay. So much social norm from interventions other than violence prevention. So there's a lot to be learned around violence. So we know a lot of data have been collected in campuses around alcohol, but here we're talking about more complex behaviors. And Alina, if you come back online, you can stop me. Social norms perspective can inform any kind of intervention beyond the model of media campaign. Understanding social norms, that's very important, requires understanding the context and the other drivers. And so that if something is a social norm in Argentina, it doesn't mean that it's social norms in Belgium. And the last point is extremely important and ends our presentation. Changing social norms and facilitating social norm change are two very different things. The first one is top-down and assumes that we know better what social norms should be in place. The second one instead empowers people to renegotiate they themselves what norms they find as harmful in way and create new norms that are compatible with the cultural context. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And I'm off mute now, but just to say that we both realize this is a lot of information. There's possibly a lot of new terms and ideas here. So we've compiled jointly a list of references at the end that include both Ben's work with Tostan, my work on the multi-country study, and the training that we've done around social norms and violence, a whole how-to guide for that, as well as the work of many of the biggest figures in the social norms field and the way that it's being applied to violence by Lori Hyce and Diffit and others. So we hope that this is only something to pique your interest, and then we're happy to hear questions now.
Thank you so much, Alina and Ben. This was a very rich series of presentations, and to the audience members, please know that we will, when we upload the recording to this, we will also upload the PowerPoint slides so that you can go to those reference slides and dig in a little bit more. I know they kind of flash through quickly here, and I think this was very dense, but in the best way. We do already have questions. I have heard from some of you that the questions in chat box are one and the same for you, so that must be something about the different formats of the webinar platform, but please do feel free to use both or either or the same one if you haven't. We have had one question come through already, and I have a question myself. We have heard from Vanda Bozic, and my apologies for pronunciation. I'm glad you mentioned gender norms. It's the first thing that comes to my mind because I live in Croatia, and unfortunately gender stereotypes are an often subject here. Last year the people voted against gay marriage, and I feel kind of helpless to what we experts can do about it. From Rhoda Kasimbu, we have the question, is there linkage between social norms and worldviews? And finally, my question to both of you is about the concept of group or the concept of community that you referred to throughout. Does my reference group or my community, sanction, agree with? Am I in line with them? Which is crucial. But the more I think about this in my own life, for example, my communities are becoming far less geographic and much more virtual. And so how does these same frameworks apply to communities that you're connected to who are nowhere near you physically? All right, those are the first three, and everyone else, please send them in. We're going to take 15 to 20 minutes to do questions here and hope to end up by about 11:15 New York time, which is 11:15 something wherever you are in the world. Over to you, Ben and Alina.
Yeah, Alina, yeah, you go.
Well, actually, I was wondering that, so the first question around gender norms and gay marriage, I was wondering, Ben, since it kind of touches on the first example that you opened up with, if you wanted to start with that one.
Oh, okay. Yeah, sure. Well, yeah, I just want, it's difficult. Changing norms is very difficult, and it's all about, it's about creating, and gender norms are so, it's about creating really a group of people that that influence, they can influence the others. Gender is a very particular, gender norms are a very particular set of social norms, because gender is so ingrained in everything, in institutions, in our relations, in the structure in which we thrive, in the agency that we exercise. So they are probably the most interesting and least less studied social norms. But think of a random group of human beings, take them, put them on the moon, and then put them naked without any having anything. What so one of the first markers of the differences will be their biological sex, which in turn will will contribute to constructing gender norms. So it's impossible to strip out gender norms from the discourse, and I do understand that it can be frustrating to feel how daunting the task of changing norms is. What we learn from experience is that the first step is motivating people in small groups in many places around the country. I don't know if you are in intervention, if you can work on that, but that would be my suggestion. And Mark, what was the second question? Yeah, do you remember the second question, Alina?
It was whether or not there's a linkage between social norms and worldview.
Yeah, and I think this, to me, thinking about both the question from Croatia and this question, you know, it's really important to note not only the driving factor of social norms, so the fact that behaviors can be determined by what we think other people expect us to do, what we think we'll receive approval for, but also, again, placing it within the socio-ecological model. So there may be material and structural drivers that are contributing to certain things being maintained. So when we think about marriage as an institution, you know, there's certain things that come with obtaining property and passing on property, right? Legal rights, fiscal rights that come along with this institution of marriage. And so, yes, the beliefs around gender and sexuality are extremely important, but there's also probably a number of, let's say, economic and material and structural factors that are also supporting the construct of marriage as it is presently seen in a lot of societies as between a man and a woman. And so we want to understand how much can we do through social norms and how can we pair that with maybe addressing some of these other ways, for example, that property is inherited. And again, I think of the work of Lori Heisey looking at violence against women and at population level factors. Changing property laws can actually, it looks like, it's significantly linked to lower levels of intimate partner violence on a national level. So there's a number of things that we would want to be able to intervene in and understand, and I think that's where we also see the linkage to worldviews. And remember that we said some things are personal, so some moral beliefs that someone holds, they may hold in the face of all evidence to the contrary. And I think today is a particularly powerful day to be talking about, you know, the use of information in changing behavior when we see how that played out in the vote that's happened in the United Kingdom, right? And so, you know, what is driving that? Is it something that's a personal or attitudinal or moral belief about what's right and what's wrong for a country to be doing? Is it factual? Is it what people voted as they thought others would vote, and that's something where I think it'd be interesting to have a social norms analysis at some point. But finally, just to say that, you know, for Mark's question about reference groups, very much they can be virtual. They do not have to be physically in the same place. I'm sure Ben will want to add here, but I do want to say in all of these questions, again, ask yourself, you know, how can an analysis of power add to this? So when we're thinking about whose decisions matter within a reference group, which reference groups, let's say, which networks of people may be more powerful in driving change? When can the law support maybe a weaker group, and when can the law actually be used to keep them out or to stop change? And then the power of generational change, so not to mistake the fact for not seeing it within 1 year or 5 years, whether it's to gay marriage laws or violence, you know, for a shift that may need a while to happen. So I would encourage everybody to be working with those longer goals in mind, and just, of course, supporting each other when we face these setbacks.
Yeah, and I do want to just say a couple of words. Worldview, I am very glad that you brought up worldviews. That, I don't remember the name of the participants who did it, but I think that's a key construct. So social norms are part of worldviews, and worldviews are placed at the intersection between the individual and social beliefs, and how these really contribute to construct the way in which individuals see the world, themselves, and others. And I think it's so important. Worldviews is a construct that is quite used in, it's a concept that is fairly used in anthropology, and I think it's a great place for it. And not all anthropologists use it, of course, but it's a great place for it, and to place the social norm discourse. Because the risk of looking at the social norm discourse with an entrepreneurial attitude is to say, well, we know what behavior is good or right and what behavior is wrong, and then we're going to create norms around this. But that would mean ignoring all the fabric of worldviews that include all these other behaviors that Alina mentioned. So effective, and by the way also ethical, intervention should they take into account the contextual worldviews to construct an intervention that facilitates from the bottom up the development of new norms, rather than trying to impose new norms that, by the way, might be more harmful than the practice that you're trying to change, or that you'd like to see changing. And that speaks to what Mark said. So there's this great article back from 1992, and I would say go and look at it. It's written by Gunning, and she essentially said, it's incredible how I travel among worlds. She's an American, but her family is originally from is it Tanzania, I think. And she says, I travel among worlds. As I move to the States, I behave, and my understanding of the world is that. And then when I move back to my village in Tanzania, the place where I come from, at the same time when I'm there, I hold beliefs that are contrasting to the first one, and I need to adapt my behavior to that, that system of beliefs and expectations. So reference group exists. Many reference groups exist that we participate of. And my work here with Lori, who's my colleague next to my room, actually she's my boss, I should probably say. My work here is exactly about that. Try to understand what is the influence of the social group, the reference groups that we believe exist, that actually are next to me, or that don't exist, or that maybe are made of people who died. Right? What if I am an Indian American and a native Indian American, and then I construct reference group across what putting expectations towards my ancestors. So these are very interesting questions, and I think the more we understand this question and other questions, we can help the world achieve greater well-being and create conciliatory practices for resolving conflict rather than violent practices.
Thank you so much, Ben. We we have two more. One's a comment and one's a question. The comment again comes from Vanda, who says it's not just a comment, not a question. I agree about property, but that isn't the case in Croatia. Here it is more about religion. It is possible to have a legal gay relationship and get the quote-unquote benefits of having a partner, inheriting property, etc., but it cannot be called marriage. That decision just sort of deepened the problem. So yes, I understand it's very difficult to change in anything in this area, so we just need to work and be very patient. Thanks for a very interesting webinar. Another question, this time from Maya Soma, who used to be a graduate research assistant with the CPC Learning Network and works now with UNICEF in Brazil. So welcome, Maya. Could the speaker suggest good references for guidelines on having conversations with communities? Here at UNICEF Brazil, the Child Protection Team will work more closely with religious leaders for violence prevention and social norms change, and I would love to know if there is a must-read or a must-know set of information and references for more information on interventions using community conversations. And before I hand that over to you, Ben and Alina, Maya, if I were to name one must-read that is about how to have respectful community conversations that address power dynamics, and it is a set of materials that emerged out of Latin America as well. It's the Training for Transformation documents. Unfortunately, they've never existed digitally, so you do have to order hard copies. But that's what I would put out there, and then I'd love to hear more from Alina and Ben on what they think.
Well, I was going to say the Training for Transformation, I think, is a really great tool. Alina, you will know this better than I do. I remember, I feel recently there was a big training pack that UNICEF has put out, but you may know about that. I would say a must-read book, which is small and will teach you a lot, is the Pedagogy of the Oppressed. The Pedagogy of the Oppressed by Paulo Freire. You spell his name F-R-E-I-R-E. It's a book. It's an old book. It's back from the 60s, but everything that's being done is based on his work. And then very recently, I'd recommend reading. It's not a guide yet, but very recently, the Global Citizenship Commission has published a report edited by Gordon Brown. So if you Google Global Citizenship Commission report Gordon Brown, you'll find it. And Appendix D to that report, which is freely available, it's all about human rights education for social transformation, and bears case study examples from India, Europe, Senegal, and Colombia. So that could be a starting point. And we're working here on one of the things we're doing here is working on a guide for bottom-up social norms change in gender-based violence that will come up probably in a year or so.
Alina, any thoughts?
Yeah, just to add to that. So, I mean, I think through all of both the comment and the question, the importance of working with faith-based groups came out. You know, extremely important, probably looks different in different places. I mean, does look different in different places. I would say, in addition to some resources that I'll mention in a minute, I think for me, when I was leading, running gender-based violence programs in different places, I've used SASA, and I know that was the subject of a recent webinar. But having used it mostly in Darfur and in Dadaab with communities there, with groups of people there, I found it tremendously transformative. And I think that those tools, which you can download the activist pack online, I think they're extremely useful. I think they're focused on working with HIV and with violence, and really find useful ways of having these what tend to be very tough conversations when talking about gender and patriarchy, the conversation around power and the way it's structured and the way that really it builds on conversations that at least some people in most communities are already having, and a way to kind of facilitate and support.
right?
S-A-S-A exclamation point. Also the work of Abad Center for Gender Equality, Resource Center for Gender Equality. This is a group in Lebanon. They work on violence against women and girls and also on harmful masculinities. That was actually kind of the core of their work at first, and so really looking at this idea of gender. And that's Abad, A-B-A-A-D. They've done a number of, they have a number of resources and also examples of interventions, particularly in media, and they've done very well-produced, high-profile media spots using the main religious leaders in Lebanon. And the context of religious life in Lebanon, everything that happens in the home is governed by one's religion, right? So there wouldn't be a civil law, for example, around domestic abuse. You would go to your religious institution and leader for that. And so they've, I think, really shown how one can work with leaders and how one can design messaging. And if you're working in a place where those voices are extremely influential and important, for whatever reason, it's really useful to see, I think, examples of how that can be done and maybe get inspired by that, start a conversation with them around your context and what might be useful there. And then finally, I would just say that within UNICEF, there's a section called Communications for Development, and they are really focused on communication with, this word communities that we throw around a lot to mean many different things. But I would really encourage looking at the resources coming out of that unit. And also there's recently been some research done by UNICEF India on child marriage, which I think applied social norms theory in an extremely useful way to, as Ben showed in his presentation, to how one can disaggregate data. So looking at data about existence of child marriage in different communities and disaggregating it to understand, is it the bulk of people in a certain community that are doing this? Is it one small group? And what's influencing their decision? So in one of the communities, it was actually a very small group of very high-income families that were continuing this practice. And so the reasons they're doing it are going to be different than another community where it might be a large group of people who really see this as a form of almost social welfare and providing, for children when they can't provide for them themselves. So I'll stop there, but really thank you for the comment and the question.
We are at an hour and 15 minutes, but we have a really great last question from Sarah Gates. Do you find overlap between interventions to address social norms and interventions to address normative beliefs at the individual level? Or do you consider these as two completely separate levels of an intervention? So I think this really gets at this question of, it was very clear to me from your presentations how we can conceive of social norms and what we're trying to address here and what we're frankly trying to change in certain circumstances. But in the going about of it, is this something that is addressed socially or individually?
So I do have an opinion on both questions. So this is quite unpopular. My response is quite unpopular. So I believe, so take it with a pinch of salt. I believe that moral norms are socially constructed at very early. I'm more and more, and I have not yet convinced, but the most convincing answer is that personal normative beliefs are socially constructed as we develop as children, as our brain develops, and then they sink in ways that distinguish them from social norms. So that essentially, and because those moral beliefs are attached to moral emotions. So when if you happen to observe some people doing cannibalism, you feel disgust, and that's what we call morality. So I think at the moment the field is treating is treating many personal normative is I think at the moment the trajectory is to explore where the personal normative beliefs and norms, social norms go together. But I think there is a lot to learn right there. And then Alina, do you want to say something on that too?
Sure. I think it's a great question. I would love to hear the person who asked it to hear what they think about it. And I'm guessing they're asking from a point of experience and kind of struggling with this. And I think, as Ben said, I do think that, you know, if we look at it through the lens of gender, which we've talked about quite a bit in this presentation, you know, growing up as a girl in some societies, there is what borders on a factual belief of what one can do and cannot do and what can be done to one and cannot be done to one, right? So I might grow up as a girl and think it's okay for my partner to beat me if I don't have everything, you know, if I don't have dinner ready. It's not okay for me to go to school. That's not my place. And so in working with these beliefs, one has to ask, you know, is that something, I think as Ben said, that's coming from, in many ways, it's socially constructed. And so at the same time as we try to change that on a social level, I think it's very important to work with individuals around these beliefs. And the most immediate example that comes to mind is a project that's called Vision Not Victim. And this is through the International Rescue Committee. And I've had some experience working with this project in Congo, where young girls are photographed being what they would like to be. So for example, one girl wanted to be the Minister of Human Rights, and so we set up a scene in the office. She's standing with the flag behind her, she's speaking to everyone, you know, we're pretending to be the cabinet. But the photo is, I mean, they're beautifully done, and they really show girls in roles that everyone is telling them they cannot be. And so it's in this way not waiting for the community to change that idea, but for these let's say outlier kind of individuals who have these dreams to be able to show them and realize them and then have discussions in the community about them using that belief. So I don't know if that's necessarily really answering your question, but it's something that comes to mind and you know, in thinking about it.
I believe that, to add on what you just said, I do believe that social norms intervention require a strong collective component, because you do need to achieve what has been defined as joint attention, which is a very simple concept. Not only I see X and you see X, but I see you and you see me seeing you, and we both are witnessing X, and that's what creates new social expectations. So if you only target individuals, they might say, okay, I got it, but you know, the others don't know this, so the others will keep doing the same thing. But it's when you both tell them the new information, as well as you show to them that others are listening to that information, and that generates discussion that is generative, that touches upon what matters to these people, well, then that's the beginning of transformation, I believe.
Well, thank you so much, Alina and Ben. This was incredibly rich. I think we're all going to be referring to this a lot as a reminder about the concepts we're working on here. And I think what came through all of this so strongly to me was that as various organizations are working to design social change interventions, or interventions that are very explicitly looking to change the way that people think about the ways that their groups act, that an ethos of respectfulness is going to be core. We will soon upload this webinar to our website, cpclearningnetwork.org, and we will make the PowerPoint presentations available there as well. Huge thanks again to Alina and Ben, and a good day, afternoon, or evening to everyone else. Bye.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.